The room carried a hum of anticipation as J.D. Vance prepared to speak. He was known for entering political conversations with a particular kind of confidence, the kind that leaned heavily on sharp remarks designed to leave his opponents off balance. On this day, his attention was fixed on Jasmine Crockett. He adjusted the microphone with the air of someone who believed he was about to seize control of the discussion. People leaned forward in their seats, some expecting substance, others expecting a jab. And Vance didn't disappoint, at least, not in the way he intended. When he finally opened his mouth, the words weren't aimed at the policies or the details of the debate. Instead, they were aimed directly at her. His tone dripped with condescension, the kind designed to make an opponent seem small before they even had a chance to respond. The insult was quick, deliberate, and loud enough to echo across the room. A few chuckles scattered through the crowd, mostly from those who already agreed with him, but many others shifted uncomfortably, sensing that what had just been thrown across the table wasn't clever strategy but rather a cheap shot. Vance leaned back, smirk in place, clearly convinced he had landed a blow that would stick. He had played this game before, using dismissive remarks to frame himself as dominant and others as weak. His body language showed the satisfaction of someone who thought the conversation was now tilted in his favor. For a brief second, he basked in that feeling, certain that the insult had disarmed Crockett before she could even open her mouth. But in that moment of satisfaction, the room itself felt uneasy. It was the kind of silence that follows when someone steps too far, when the audience senses the intent isn't to elevate a discussion but to drag it down. Some faces in the crowd tightened, not in admiration but in disapproval. They had come expecting arguments, clarity, and insight, and instead, Vance had opted for a personal jab. His words hung there, heavy, not because of their cleverness, but because of their pettiness. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle papers nervously, nor did she avert her gaze. Instead, she simply sat straighter, her expression steady, letting the weight of his words fall flat in the air before her. While Vance believed he had put her in a defensive position, what was really happening was quite the opposite. His insult revealed more about his approach than about her readiness. The audience saw it for what it was, an attempt to rattle rather than reason, to insult rather than inform. The setup was clear. J.D. Vance had intended to define her with his words. His tactic was familiar, the classic maneuver of dismissing someone before they had a chance to present themselves. He had calculated that the sting of the insult would overshadow any response she could offer. To him, it was a moment of control, a declaration that he held the upper hand. Yet in reality, what he had done was create the perfect stage for her response. There was something telling in the way Vance handled himself after delivering the remark. His shoulders relaxed, his eyes flickered briefly across the audience, and his lips curled in satisfaction. He expected murmurs of agreement to build, for his comment to ripple like a wave through the room. But the wave never came. Instead, there was a strange pause, as if people were holding their breath, waiting to see how Crockett would respond. The power he thought he had secured was slipping even before she opened her mouth. In that silence, J.D. Vance's attempt at dominance became a moment of vulnerability. He had chosen to insult rather than engage, and in doing so, he placed himself in a precarious position. If Crockett had faltered, he would have succeeded. But if she didn't, she rose above the attempt, his words would expose him as someone who relied on belittlement when real debate was required. That was the gamble he had taken, and he didn't yet realize just how costly it would be. When the insult left J.D. Vance's lips, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was one of those moments when everyone waits to see if the target will stumble, stutter, or retreat. But Jasmine Crockett didn't do any of those things. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a calmness settling over her face that made it clear she wasn't shaken. The insult might have been crafted to cut deep, but in her demeanor, it barely registered. She leaned toward the microphone, her eyes fixed squarely on him. And in that pause, before she spoke, she had already shifted the balance of the room. Her first words carried no hint of anger, no raised pitch, no desperation to match his tone. They were measured and firm, the kind of words that slice through noise rather than add to it. She repeated part of his remark back to him, not in mockery, but in a way that exposed its emptiness. By holding his words up to the light, she forced everyone listening to consider them again, this time without the smirk attached to them. And when the audience reconsidered, the insult lost its edge and became what it truly was: petty, shallow, and unworthy of the moment. J.D. Vance's posture shifted slightly, his shoulders tightening as she continued. Crockett's voice didn't waver, and her composure didn't crack. She didn't play into the tension he tried to create. Instead, she redirected it. Every sentence she delivered dismantled the framework he had tried to build. Rather than meeting insult with insult, she chose precision, crafting her rebuttal in a way that elevated the conversation while quietly cornering him. Her words didn't just defend her, they revealed the weakness in his approach. At one point, she turned his own tactic against him. Where he had tried to reduce her, she widened the lens to reveal the shallowness of his attack. She noted how easy it was to throw out dismissive remarks, but how much harder it was to engage with the real issues at hand. The audience responded with a low murmur, the kind that comes when people recognize a truth laid bare in front of them. Crockett never raised her voice, yet the weight of her delivery made every syllable hit harder than if she had shouted. Vance tried to maintain his smirk, but it no longer fit his face. He looked less like someone in control and more like someone struggling to recover ground. His fingers tapped lightly against the table, a subtle tell of restlessness. He hadn't expected her to hold her ground so calmly, and he certainly hadn't expected her to turn the moment around so quickly. The insult he thought would define her instead became a mirror, reflecting back his own reliance on tactics that lacked substance. Crockett pressed on, not lingering on his words, but using them as a springboard to address the broader conversation. It was a masterful mover than dwelling on the insult. She exposed it as a distraction from what really mattered. Her tone implied that she wouldn't be dragged into petty games when real issues were at stake, and in doing so, she elevated herself while leaving him standing in the shadow of his own remark. What made her response sting wasn't just the content, it was the control. Vance had entered the exchange assuming that throwing her off balance would put him in command, but Crockett's steadiness turned the tables. Every second she remained poised underscored his miscalculation. The audience could see it plainly. One person had chosen substance, the other had chosen spectacle, and in that comparison, the spectacle was losing. As she finished her response, there was no need for dramatic pauses or overemphasis. Her words carried their own weight, resonating more because of the simplicity with which she delivered them. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was People absorbed the sharpness of her reply, recognizing that she hadn't just answered an insult, she had dismantled the very tactic behind it. And sitting just across from her, Vance shifted again. The earlier confidence he displayed now replaced with the unease of someone who realized the ground beneath him was no longer solid. The silence after Jasmine Crockett's response lingered in the air like a spotlight, and in that silence, the attention shifted. No longer were people focused on whether she could withstand Vance's insult. Now the focus was on him. The power dynamic in the room had flipped without any grand gestures, and it became increasingly clear with every passing second that his attempt to dominate had backfired. Instead of Crockett appearing flustered or defensive, she sat with the same composure she had carried all along. While Vance was left to manage the weight of his own failed maneuver, he shifted in his seat, his earlier self-assured posture slowly unraveling. The smirk that once sat confidently on his face had thinned into something less certain, almost forced, as though he was trying to hold on to the image of control. His eyes darted across the room, searching for reinforcement from the audience. But the response he had expected was no longer there. Where he had anticipated laughter or approving nods, there was instead quiet acknowledgement of what had just unfolded. Crockett's words had reframed the entire moment, exposing the fragility of his approach. What made the shift so striking was that she hadn't needed to shout him down or match insult with insult. She had let his own words betray him. The insult that once sounded bold now seemed hollow. A weak attempt at gaining attention rather than contributing to the discussion. As Crockett continued with her points, each sentence placed a greater contrast between her steady substance and his earlier theatrics. In that contrast, Vance's comment began to look less like strategy and more like a mistake. It became clear to those in the room that he hadn't come prepared to defend ideas as much as he had come prepared to belittle. Crockett had shown that she was ready to speak on policy, on facts, on the deeper issues at hand. He, on the other hand, had chosen to begin with personal attacks. And now that those attacks had been dismantled, there was little left for him to stand on. The spotlight, once his to control, illuminated that weakness with brutal clarity. Vance tried to recover, leaning back toward the microphone with a few quick phrases that were meant to restore his footing. But his voice carried differently now, as though the certainty had drained out of it. The sharpness he had wielded earlier was dulled, and the more he spoke, the more it became obvious that the room wasn't with him in the way he had expected. His efforts to press forward sounded like someone trying to patch a sinking ship, while Crockett, with calm composure, continued to steer the conversation toward substance. The more she spoke, the less his earlier insult mattered, except as a reminder of how poorly it had landed. Each point she made underscored the fact that he had chosen a shallow path. And by contrast, she stood as the one carrying the weight of seriousness and credibility. Even those who might have sided with him ideologically could not ignore the fact that she had taken control without breaking stride. The shift was undeniable. He had been the aggressor, but she was the one who now commanded respect. There was something telling in the audience's reactions. Small nods, slight murmurs of agreement, and the attentive silence all leaned in her direction. Vance meanwhile found himself isolated in his own tactic. A man who had tried to reduce his opponent, only to reduce himself. The stage that he had believed would spotlight his strength, now revealed his lack of substance. It wasn't just about the insult anymore, it was about what the insult revealed. That when stripped of theatrics, he had little to offer in that moment. Asterisk. By the time Crockett finished her response, J.D. Vance no longer looked like the instigator who had the upper hand. Instead, he appeared unsettled, caught in the very trap he had tried to set. His words, meant to define her, had instead defined him, and not in the way he intended. The shift was complete. Crockett was no longer simply defending herself. She was leading the exchange, and he was left trying to recover ground he had already lost. By the time Jasmine Crockett reached the conclusion of her remarks, the tone of the room had transformed. What began as J.D. Vance's attempt to frame her as unworthy of serious engagement had turned into a masterclass in control, and the shift was visible not just in her words but in the energy of the space itself. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't descended into theatrics, and yet, she was the one who held the audience in the palm of her hand. The same people who had braced themselves for an exchange filled with insults were now leaning forward. Absorbed in the clarity of her reasoning, Vance, in stark contrast, no longer radiated the certainty he had carried at the start. His smirk had faded completely, replaced by an expression that alternated between forced composure and visible unease. The insult he had delivered earlier was no longer alive in the room. It had been dismantled so thoroughly that it hung over him like a shadow, a reminder of what he had tried and failed to do. Crockett didn't need to return to it. The damage to him was already done, and the strength she projected only made that clearer. Her calm authority did more than silence his insults, elevated her beyond the level of a sparring partner. She wasn't merely responding to him anymore, she was leading the entire discussion. Each time she spoke, the audience tuned in with a focus that left Vance on the margins. It was as if he had unintentionally written himself out of the story, reduced to a figure waiting awkwardly for his next turn, while she defined the moment with confidence and substance. What made the impact so undeniable was how effortlessly she did it. Crockett didn't waste time celebrating the fact that she had undercut him, nor did she allow herself to be dragged down into the mud he had tried to pull her into. Instead, she pushed forward with the issues at hand, proving that she could withstand insult without losing sight of the bigger picture. That steadiness carried weight, and it left Vance looking like someone who had misjudged not only his opponent but also the audience. As Crockett pressed on, even her pauses spoke volumes. Where Vance had filled the air with quick remarks designed for effect, she allowed her words to land and settle. That confidence in silence, that refusal to rush or retreat, amplified the sense that she was in command. It made his earlier attempt at dominance appear flimsy by comparison. The contrast was striking. One person had chosen substance and composure, the other had chosen spectacle and insult. The audience didn't need to be told who had come out ahead. It was already clear in the way people were listening. Vance tried to interject once more, searching for footing in a conversation that had slipped beyond his control, but each attempt sounded weaker than the last. The authority he once projected was gone, and what remained was a tone of defensiveness. The more he tried to recover, the more obvious it became that he was reacting to her lead rather than directing the exchange himself. Crockett didn't have to silence him. His own earlier choice had already done that. By the end of the exchange, she stood not only unshaken but elevated. Her rebuttal had transformed an attempted insult into an example of her strength. Vance, on the other hand, was left diminished. The confidence with which he had entered the discussion no longer recognizable. His words had been meant to belittle, but in reality, they had revealed his reliance on tactics that couldn't withstand real scrutiny. She had destroyed the insult without ever appearing destructive herself by embodying composure. She had undone him. The moment became more than just a clash between two figures. It was a study in contrasts. Crockett's presence had grown as the exchange unfolded, while Vance's shrank. She had turned the insult into a springboard, lifting herself while leaving him stuck in the consequences of his own misstep. The impact was lasting, the kind of impression that lingers long after the microphones are turned off. J.D. Vance had entered the room with the confidence of someone ready to dominate, but by the end, it was Jasmine Crockett who had commanded the space, and he was left sitting in the silence of what he had lost. What unfolded between J.D. Vance and Jasmine Crockett was not simply a clash of personalities, but a revealing example of how words, tone, and composure can shape the outcome of an entire exchange. He had come into the moment with sharpness, aiming to undermine her before she had the chance to fully engage. His insult was crafted to plant doubt about her credibility, a tactic designed to draw attention to her supposed weakness rather than his own arguments. But in delivering it, he underestimated both her readiness and her resolve. Crockett's response was not the dramatic retaliation one might expect when faced with such an attack. Instead, it was deliberate, controlled, and strikingly effective. She didn't need to outshout him, nor did she have to descend to the level of petty barbs. Her strength was in her ability to remain steady, letting his words reveal more about him than they ever could about her. That steadiness allowed her to turn his insult on its head, transforming it into a spotlight on the superficiality of his approach. The shift was visible. As she spoke, the insult he had thrown moments earlier began to shrink in importance. It no longer carried the sting he intended. Instead, it became a reminder of how fragile his strategy was when met with composure and substance. The more she explained her points, the clearer it became that he had relied on spectacle rather than substance. The audience could see it too, and their focus began to follow her more than him. What started as his attempt to dominate became her opportunity to lead. Asterisk for Vance. The consequences were subtle but undeniable. His smirk faded, his posture wavered, and his words no longer carried the same weight. Each attempt to recover sounded less like confident leadership and more like scrambling to regain footing. He had wanted to put Crockett on the defensive, but instead he found himself reacting to her poise. The very weapon he tried to wield, dismissiveness, turned against him, leaving him diminished in the eyes of those watching. Asterisk Crockett, by contrast, left the exchange elevated. She hadn't just answered an insult, she had redefined the moment. By refusing to let his remark dictate her response, she showcased the strength of calm authority, the kind that resonates long after the sound of words fades. Her ability to stay grounded didn't just protect her credibility, it enhanced it, showing that confidence doesn't come from theatrics, but from clarity and composure. Asterisk, in the end, what stood out wasn't the insult itself, but how it was handled. J.D. Vance's attempt to reduce her ended up reducing himself, while Jasmine Crockett turned the same moment into proof of her resilience. The story wasn't about a loud takedown or a heated confrontation, it was about how control, substance, and presence can dismantle even the sharpest attempt at ridicule. What was meant to be her undoing became her defining moment, and what was meant to secure his dominance instead left him sitting in the quiet